They're calling it the Battle of Donbas. After nearly 2 months of mishaps and setbacks, Russia putting all its might into a bid to capture the entire east of Ukraine. Capture it or flatten it. We'll ask about the Kremlin's endgame and the scramble to rearm the Ukrainians, who insists that resolve can't make up for Russia's air superiority and long-range missile capability. How all in does the West go at this juncture? How does it handle the stymied Vladimir Putin, who after last week's sinking of a flagship naval cruiser has already extended his bombing campaign to cities like Kyiv and Lviv? What happens if he still doesn't get results this time? Remember, even Mariupol still hasn't completely fallen. Would he be tempted to do what no leader seriously considered during the whole of the Cold War and use tactical nuclear weapons? We'll put it to the panel. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the Battle of Donbas. Joining us from Warsaw, Ukrainian political analyst Maria Zolkina is with us. You are with the Ilko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Thanks for being with us again in the France 24 debate.
Hello, nice to be here with you.
In a previous life, he was economic advisor to Vladimir Putin. Today, he's a fierce critic. Joining us from Washington, Andrei Ilyarnarov, senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
From Santander, Spain, former NATO Director of Policy Planning Fabrice Potier, Chief Strategy Officer at political consultants Rasmussen Global. How are you?
I'm very well. Nice to be with you tonight.
He's the author of Bear Hunting with the Politburo. Craig Capitas, contributing editor at Quartz and the Daily Beast. How are things?
Okay, Francois.
The France 24 debate where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. The Battle of Donbas announced in the nightly address by Ukraine's president. Emerald Maxwell has more.
A large Russian offensive in the Donbas region had been expected for weeks. Now President Zelensky says it's begun.
We can now state that Russian troops have begun the battle for the Donbas, for which they've been preparing for a long time. A significant part of the entire Russian army is now concentrated on this offensive. No matter how many Russian troops are brought there, we will fight.
In recent weeks, the Kremlin declared it would focus its war efforts on capturing the Donbas after its attempt to storm Kyiv failed. The eastern region is mostly Russian-speaking, and Moscow-backed separatists have been fighting Ukrainian forces there for the past 8 years. The governor of Luhansk in the Donbas said the situation was hell, with constant fighting in some areas. Places like the city of Rubizhne, which is under continual shelling. Less than 2 kilometers away, this village hasn't been spared either.
The children went away, and the Ukrainian army had a tank here. As soon as the tank left, Russia hit the house.
In recent days, Russian forces have also continued their push to capture the besieged port city of Mariupol in the south of Donbas. Moscow has also stepped up its air attacks on Lviv in the west and other targets across the country in what appeared to be an intensified bid to grind down Ukraine's defences ahead of the renewed offensive in the east.
Let me begin with you, Maria Zolkina, because in the last couple of hours, the United States offering up its assessment that what we're seeing this Tuesday with Russian forces attacking along a front line that runs hundreds of kilometers long, it's only a prelude, they're saying. Your thoughts, is the battle begun in earnest?
Actually, yes, this is the prelude for a serious attack, or actually the first days of its attacks. It will mean that until Russia will capture the whole Donbas, until Russia will stop at least these attempts to capture and occupy the whole Donbas, Russia won't stop. But unfortunately for Ukrainian Donbas, and unfortunately for Ukraine generally, even Donbas will be not enough. It will be not sufficient military victory for Russia, even if Russian army is successful in capturing new territories in Donbas.
Are you surprised that it's happening this fast? Because as we saw in that report, Mariupol has yet to fall, and that means that there are 12 Russian battalion tactical groups tied down in fighting there.
Actually, what is going on now, or what was announced yesterday as the beginning of new offensive against Donbas, is nothing unexpected. For instance, the heaviest shellings ever they were taking place in Luhansk region for last 3.5 weeks, or even up to 4 weeks. Not only Mariupol was the hot spot in Donbas. The main battles, or the main fightings, direct ones between Ukrainian army and Russian army, they were taking place, for instance, in Luhansk region for several weeks already. So we were expecting that Russian troops will be strengthened with new units, with new repaired vehicles, and they will try to go further in order to occupy new territories.
All right, and we also saw, and we saw images of it in that report on Monday, the western city of Lviv awakening to its first fatalities from Russian bombing. 7 killed in the attack on a location that throughout the war has so far mostly managed to retain its Mittel Europa flavor, cafe culture, old streets, despite the war. Lviv's regional governor blames 4 cruise missiles, which, according to him, are believed to have been fired from all the way over in the Caspian Sea. Does that sound plausible to you, Fabrice Potier?
I think what is plausible, what you are seeing, is that there is a strategy to both concentrate the kind of war of destruction that the Russians are engaging with in the Donbas, and at the same time to keep the pressure on major population centers in Western Ukraine. That's a way for Russia to say, we're not letting you, claim victory and pretend that our withdrawal was basically a loss. So I think it's a way to keep the pressure on Zelensky. However, what needs to be noted is these missiles and cruise missiles are actually pretty expensive, and most countries, including Russia, don't have very big stocks of it. And I would assume that the Russians are going to run out of cruise missiles and precision-guided munitions pretty soon. So I think they are not going to be able to prosecute that kind of strategy for very long.
Yeah, the Pentagon this Tuesday saying that Russia has used up already a quarter of its manpower. Does that mean that Russia does, in fact, need a win very fast?
Well, and there is the military parade of the 9th of May on the Red Square. So Putin will for sure want to display some sort of victory or success, which obviously the thinking of the Moscow does not really go in that direction. What it tells us, and I think it's very important to your auditors, is that this war can be won by the Ukrainians. That it's not given that Vladimir Putin is going to prevail, and it's a question of how we can support them right now and on the long haul.
And supporting them in the long haul, Craig Kapitas, well, that means hardware. It means we had on top of the $800 million pledged by the United States last week, and things like howitzers and switchblade drones, armored personnel carriers, this kind of thing, that Ukraine is asking for more. How much can the West give, though?
$800 million is the cost of one of Roman Abramovich's yachts. It's nothing. It's peanuts, chump change. Putin does not need to win. He needs to manufacture a win for the Russians, because the Russians believe that this is a holy war and it's going to be won eventually. So I think that's a very, very important point. The question is, when real military hardware comes in, the stuff that can really do some damage for the Ukrainians, what is Putin's response going to be to that? Is he going to start shooting down cargo planes when they're in EU territory? Is he going to start shooting down NATO planes as they come into the Ukraine? We don't know.
All right, let's get to that second point in a moment. Let's first pick up on your first point with Andrei Ilyanarov. Do you agree with Craig Kapitas that Putin doesn't need to win? He needs to manufacture a win. He needs to show his own people, to sell a win, basically, to his own people.
Putin is good in fabrication of different scenarios and pretending that he's doing different roles. he could do anyway. But essentially, we look into his soul. If he would have that, he definitely would like to get not only Donbas, but Kiev, capital of Ukraine. Regardless what he is saying right now, regardless how many people in the West or around the world would try to believe him, the end goal for him is Kiev. So that is why if he would be able to win in Donbas, I hope it will not happen, but if it happens, so Putin would continue his attacks and offensive, and his goal would be Kiev. So using the numbers that have been mentioned about the hardware that is being supplied to Ukraine, I would support a view that it is next to nothing, 800 million US dollars. I would like to remind that during the Afghan campaign, United States spent slightly more than 100 billion US dollars a year, and they were fighting mujahids from Taliban without any hardware, without any heavy equipment, without any tanks, any jets, any missiles, only with guns. So you need to, and everybody should understand how much war is being waged right now and how much hardware and weapons and ammunition should be sent to Ukraine to give Ukrainians an opportunity to resist this aggression.
Well, let me get your reaction to earlier we spoke with U.S. Senator Chris Coons, who happens to be here with a congressional delegation in Paris. We got his reaction to Germany's chancellor saying that his country's practically maxed out the weapons it can deliver from its own stocks and is instead working with the armaments industry to produce more.
Well, one of the big surprises in recent weeks has been just how forceful Chancellor Scholz and the new German government has been in cutting off Nord Stream 2, in providing lethal aid.
Andrei Ilinov, your reaction?
I think this new German chancellor is doing what exactly he needs to do. Because the war that Ukrainians is waging against Russian aggressor is a war not only about Ukraine and not to defend not only Ukraine. This is defense of whole Europe. Putin has made very clear statements many times, and especially very clear back last December, which he repeated in January, February, and even in March, that his goal is Europe, and Ukraine is only the first step. So fortunately, new German chancellor understands it very well. And that is why he understands that the defense of Europe could be only united. And he organizes support from Germany. I hope some other leaders, including French one, would understand it as well and would support Ukraine at least at the same level as Germans.
Fabrice Potier, is France supporting Germany at the same level? Supporting Ukraine at the same level as Germany?
Well, first, let me respond to the precedent point. I do disagree with the characterization that Germany is actively doing what it should do. I think it's highly disappointing to see Chancellor Scholz and his coalition still, I think, having huge doubt about exactly what it means to spend 100 billion euro for basically beefing up German defense. It's also highly disappointing to see that they are not able to deliver significant equipment and capabilities to Ukraine, when actually the German industry is delivering tanks to Sisi, who is not the most democratic leader in the world. And finally, it is highly disappointing to see Germany holding the whole of the EU's energy sanctions, and especially on oil, which fundamentally is where we could really make a big bite on Vladimir Putin's war machine by cutting Russian oil export to Europe, and yet Germany is still doubting and is still agonizing over that decision. So in a way, Berlin has the key to victory or defeat for the Ukrainians, and it is kind of disappointing to see that they're not willing to go all the way.
When it comes to armament, is there a difference in public relations between some of the NATO members? The U.S. is perhaps more vocal than others. The French defense minister has been almost silent since the start of the war.
With full respect, I've been in touch with senior officials in Kiev, so I have the other version of what they received from the NATO allies. And it's pretty clear that the Eastern NATO allies, the Northern allies, as well as the United States and United Kingdom, have been the ones providing the most significant capabilities. And Germany, and to an extent France, have been missing in action. And yet, it is true that France has been providing munitions, fuel, other things. But the reality is that for one of the world's top exporters in armament, France is punching way below its weight.
You agree with that, Maria Zalkina?
Yes, of course, Ukraine see the difference and distinguish between Eastern Europe on the one hand, US and UK plus to the Eastern Europe on the one hand, and Western Europe on another hand. And if we will pay more attention to what is going on in bilateral relations between, for instance, Ukraine and Germany, we will see how tense these relations are since end of February after invasion, not only because of lack of military support or because of refusal during a long period of time to organize any supplies of military character to Ukraine, but also because of, let's say, political position or relation towards economic sanctions. In the period between 2014 and 2022, Germany was one of the main forces in the European Union to preserve the sanctions which were launched against Russia after it occupied Crimea and started the war in Donbas. But after the large-scale invasion, which is not doubtful anymore, Germany's position against, for instance, economic sanctions is much softer than it was expected on the side of Ukraine. So the problem is not only with military, but at the same time, for instance, what I have heard from Ukrainian side officials, that France, on the other hand, has been presenting itself and has been involving into attempts to support Ukraine politically, diplomatically, and since a large-scale invasion in much, let's say, more favorable way than it was expected from France. So bilateral relations, they are shifting, they are dynamic, but German and Ukrainian relations, they are not on a necessary level of bilateral cooperation and bilateral understanding what should be done in order to save territorial integrity of Ukraine.
Yeah, in any case, the arms are beginning to come in. Will they be enough is another matter. The arming and rearming of Ukraine. We're seeing, for instance, the British are starting to supply those anti-naval missiles. It's triggered a sharp reaction this Tuesday from Russia's defense minister.
The United States and Western countries are doing everything to drag out the special military operation as much as possible. The growing supplies of foreign weapons clearly signal their intention to provoke the Kyiv regime to keep fighting until the last Ukrainian.
The special military operation, still not calling it a war, Craig Kapitas. What's interesting about that clip is that there had been rumors last week that Sergei Shoigu had been sidelined or had a heart attack. There's a lot of fog of war. What do you make of what he's saying there? How do you read it?
That every rumor coming out of Russia is decorated with a wisp of truth. That NATO is scared witless of Vladimir Putin. This is why they're not giving the kind of weapons they should have been giving them weeks ago. And the reason is because there was an assumption during the Cold War, and that assumption was that the sanest men in the world, even Brezhnev and Khrushchev, they were sane men, then they had their finger on the nuclear trigger. Sane men. That's not the case anymore. You can say that Vladimir Putin is mad, he's off his rocker, let the psychologists deal with that. What you can say...
Well, he's not suicidal.
No, but he does have Armageddon fever.
How so?
they're still willing to push a button, and they use tactical nuclear weapons, they say. Well, for someone like me, there's no difference between a tactical nuke and any other kind of nuke. When you start talking about nuclear weapons, you're bringing in a whole other panel of experts who start talking about throw weights, kilotonnage, wind variations, etc. It's a whole nother science as it is. And Putin has threatened this. And it's not really the chemical weapons. He's used chemical weapons before. Everyone gets upset. It's will he use the nukes? And so far, no one has been willing to call his bluff. And I think in this respect, Putin is winning, basically because, Abramovich spends more on one of his yachts than the amount of weaponry we've been giving the Ukraine. The West is scared of Putin.
Andrei Ilyanov, you agree that Vladimir Putin could, if the circumstances were such, have an itchy trigger finger when it comes to the button?
I think it's a wrong topic to discuss at all. I think it's a big mistake to raise this issue and discuss in a way that is being discussed right now. For a person who has been killed, or who has been murdered, who has been tortured in Ukraine, there is no difference what particular weapon has been used for that, whether nukes or regular weapons or chemical weapons, whether it's missiles or tanks or grass, whatever. Doesn't matter if the person is being killed. And Ukrainians, seems to me, have taken such a decision that they would resist this attack and they would defend their own country regardless what kind of weapons is being used against them. I think it's a very right approach to the aggressor, to resist own country, to resist freedom and independence, not only of own country, but of whole Europe. And I hope that sooner or later, Europeans and all Western nations would come to the same approach. Regardless what kind of weapons is being used in reality or is being threatened to use, they would support Ukraine with all possible efforts. And we also have some basis to believe that Mr. Putin is using nuclear bluff only against those who is afraid of this nuclear bluff. For example, Turkey has closed Straits of Bosporus and Dardanelles, therefore closing the Black Sea from entrance of the 5th Special Escadron of Russian Navy. Though in this way they are preserving attack on Nikolaev, Odessa, Ochakov on the Ukrainian coast. What kind of reaction from Mr. Putin was towards Turkey? Whether Putin was using nukes against Turkey? No. Whether Putin was threatening Turkey to use nukes? No. Whether any propaganda person from Kremlin was trying to threaten Turkey with use of nukes? No. Even Mr. Kiselev, who years ago promised to leave a nuclear ash from Washington, never said a word about that. What does it mean? It means that only one country is taking very serious steps in helping Ukraine in the purely military efforts, and there is no reaction from Kremlin. Why? Because Mr. Erdogan is not afraid of nuclear bluff. If European leaders, if all Western leaders will not be afraid of using nukes or chemical weapons or any other weapons against them or against anyone, and they would be pretty tough in support of Ukraine and would contribute more efforts, economic and purely military ones, for defending common course, that bluff would disappear.
Last week we saw this renewed push by Finland and Sweden to join NATO. They're countries that are within striking distance of the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, which shares borders with Lithuania. And Poland, you can see on this map the NATO member states right now. Fabrice Potier, are Finland and Sweden making that push to join NATO? Because why are they doing it? Does nuclear weapons come into their calculus?
I think what comes in the calculus is that you can no longer afford to live in that region, the Baltic region, with the doubt that if something were to happen, you are not 100% sure that the United States and the 29 other NATO allies will join and support you. And that's this doubt they want to close by joining the alliance. And I can predict that by the NATO Madrid summit in mid-June, there won't be 30 NATO allies, but 32. But just to come back to the nuclear aspect, I think here I agree with what the preceding speaker explained. I think it's for us to lose this war. And what is quite disturbing is when you go to the NATO headquarters, what you hear is the concern of Vladimir Putin losing. Basically, the West is scared of Putin losing rather than focusing on actually making the Ukrainians win. And I think this shows how we got trapped into Putin's own fiction and own bluff. And it's really time to actually not let him hijack us with his nuclear blackmail.
So don't offer him an exit ramp. Don't offer him a face saving.
No. What it means is this is going to be won and decided on the military ground. This is a conflict that has a military outcome. The notion, like promoted for years by Federal President Steinmeier, that there is not such a thing as a military solution, is completely defeated by what you see in Ukraine. There is a military outcome to this war, which will decide to a very large extent what the diplomatic settlement will be. And I think we need to do much more and can do much more to actually make sure the military outcome is in favor of the Ukrainians, including pushing back on nuclear blackmail, which starts by saying that nuclear weapons or WMDs have no role whatsoever to play in this conflict. And the moment Vladimir Putin will bring those weapons to the table, the consequences will be terrible. And it is indeed of great concern that the Western leaders have not said that sufficiently clear to actually push back on his nuclear blackmail, which, just to finish, is being looked at by the Chinese as something that actually could be interesting for them to use in their territorial claims in the South China Sea.
Mario Zolkina, let me ask you, Vladimir Putin has set up this May the 9th kind of deadline. It's a big date on the Russian calendar. It's a day they celebrate VE Day, the victory in World War II. He wants to have a result by May the 9th. What happens if he doesn't have a result by May the 9th?
More severe battles, more severe shelling of residential areas, including Kyiv, from where Russian troops have already pulled back, more shellings and missile and air bombardment attacks on western cities of Ukraine. That is the raw of events, of military developments we are to expect in case there will be no significant result for Russia in the current battle for Ukrainian Donbas and for Ukrainian South. And the serious difference between, let's say, Russian perception of the situation, Russian political understanding of how the situation should develop, and Western perception of the situation is that ideology and some symbols, they mean much more in this war for Russia than can be predicted or could be predicted by our Western partners. And that is why coming 2 weeks, next 2 weeks, up to the Victory Day, Russia will do its best to try to defeat or at least seriously weaken maybe the most efficient parts of units of Ukrainian army in the Donbas. I hardly believe they will be successful in defeating the army and occupying Donbas, but it will mean less. If there is less military success against Ukrainian army, there will be more cruelty and severe shellings against Ukrainian civilians and there will be casualties, civilians, and destruction, and so on. And Mariupol, please keep in mind that as of now, the official position of Ukrainian authorities is like, if civilians and Ukrainian defenders of the city in Mariupol will be murdered as of now, political negotiations will be closed for this very moment.
Craig Kapitas.
Nuclear weapons. Cold prickle of terror goes down your spine. Notice how the whole tone of the conversation changed? Well, you just interviewed U.S. Senator Chris Coons from the state of Delaware, who brought this up. Vladimir Putin has brought this issue up a number of times. Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, has said, we're not going to use them. Well, anything the Kremlin says is a lie, so forget about it.
They never used them during the whole of the Cold War.
This is not the Cold War. This is a holy war by Vladimir Putin to try and take over Ukraine and then go and try and take over the old Russian Empire. So let's put the moral fogginess to rest here. The weapons that Ukraine desperately needs to defeat the Russian ragtag army on the battlefield, which, remember, it's just a lot of artillery. That's basically all they're good at, blowing things up. That weaponry has not arrived. So you have to ask yourself, why hasn't it arrived yet? Why are the French hiding under the chair? Why are the Germans hiding under their desks? Why? And from everything I've been able to ascertain from reporting, is this fear, this cold prickle of terror of Putin actually doing something with a nuclear weapon. And if he does, God forbid, if he does use a nuke, there is a specific set of protocols in the United States and within NATO on how you respond to it. It doesn't matter whether it's tactical or an ICBM. It's a whole nother ballgame, even as if when you asked Senator Coons of Delaware, the idea of Putin firing one off from Kaliningrad into the middle of the Baltic Sea to say, hey, see what I can do? There is a protocoled response to that, and I can guarantee you it's not pretty.
Very briefly on this point, Fabrice Potier.
Yes, I do agree that I think we have lost, in a way, our nuclear deterrence grammar. We don't know how to speak back against nuclear blackmail, and we are indeed, I think, too scared by the Russian nuclear power. But the fundamentals of nuclear deterrence is that if one actor decides to wave that flag, you need to wave back the consequences of doing so. And I think we need to kind of strengthen our spine here and indeed have the courage to say that those weapons have nothing to do in this conflict. But if they were, obviously there are plans, and obviously NATO is a nuclear alliance, and the consequences will be terrible. And I can bet you that Putin will actually not be willing to go that far, because at the end he may have made a bad judgment on his war campaign in Ukraine. But I don't think he's fundamentally an irrational actor, and it's to a very large extent about the survival of his own regime. So I think he's got that survival instinct, and I'm not sure nuclear is serving him in that sense.
All right, there's movement on the armament front, that is for certain. Weapons are coming in. There's also movement on the sanctions front, and yet, over in Moscow, at least in public, they're crowing. The initial panic of investors after the February 24th invasion has subsided to the point where the ruble is now firmed up. And despite those sanctions, Russia on Monday lifting a ban on foreign currency transactions.
Но можно уже уверенно сказать, что такая политика в отношении России провалилась. Стратегия экономического блицкрига не удалась. Более того, санкции не прошли даром и для самих инициаторов. Имею в виду рост инфляции и безработицы, ухудшение экономической динамики в США и странах Европы, снижение уровня жизни европейцев, девальвация их сбережений.
Andrei Ilyanov, what was your reaction when you heard Vladimir Putin talking about the West's economic blitzkrieg?
If I may just a word concerning the potential response on nuclear bluff from Putin in the West. We know that Boris Johnson has found a response. He said that if Putin would use nukes, it will be direct response from Britain, regardless of consultations with allies. So I think it would be good time now for the French side and for the US side join British Prime Minister in making a very clear and strong statements that any potential attempt of Kremlin to use nuke will have a very clear and direct response, not only from London, but from Paris and Washington. As for the so-called economic blitzkrieg, as we know, Mr. Putin is, as usually, lying. But what is really very important, that it looks like that not all foreign exchange reserves of Central Bank of Russia have been essentially frozen. And Central Bank is having enough reserves to start these exchange operations. So that is why it's critically important for the Western countries to introduce a real embargo on Russian oil and gas. Right now, Russia is receiving about $1 billion a day for Russian oil and gas, mostly for selling these energy resources to Europe. If Western countries would introduce a real embargo on all export from Russia of energy resources, it would be very substantial blow to the stability, economic stability and financial stability. Right now, direct revenues from energy resources constitute about 40% of Russian federal budget revenues, with indirect revenues up to 60%. Without those revenues that are essentially financing the war machine of the aggressor, Putin would be not able to continue war within several months.
So what do you do? Andre, let me ask you, what do you do if you're a country like Germany, you're heavily dependent on Russian gas? Vladimir Putin is saying, put it here in Gazprom Bank. You can put it right now still in euros. They called his bluff on putting it in rubles. But still, what do? You can't from one day to the next stop importing Russian gas.
You can do it. I can explain how you can do it. You can introduce so-called escrow accounts. What does it mean? It means Russia is continuing to export oil and gas to European countries. European countries are receiving all this oil and gas. Moreover, they are paying for this gas and for this oil. But they put all these payments not directly to the Russian companies, but to a particular escrow accounts at which they are technically continue to be a property of the Russian companies, but they cannot use them until the end of the war. And they can use this money only when the war will be finished, Russian troops will be withdrawn from Ukraine, and Russia will compensate for all damages that Russian troops made to Ukraine. After that, this property of Russian companies and Russian state can be returned to their owners. But until the war is finished, this money will be accumulated on escrow accounts.
Wouldn't buy that deal.
Why not, Craig Kapitas?
Because I'd have to sign on to paying reparations to Ukraine from that pot of money. Putin's not going to sign that deal.
Correctly.
You know, but there's this belief, there's still this belief that Putin cares about the Russian people. He doesn't. What we've been doing in the West, and maybe we're not doing it enough, but we preach to the choir all the time. The people who need to know what's really going on are the Russian people, and they don't know. And from what I understand from talking with folks in Moscow, they're not going out into the streets to overthrow Vladimir Putin. It is not going to happen. He has shut the place down effectively. So that's wishful thinking. It goes back to this core issue, and I think Andre pointed this out quite well. You got to beat this SOB on the battlefield in the Ukraine. And to do that, you got to get him the weapons, and we're not getting the weapons to Zelensky's troops, certainly not the right kind of weapons. So it's time for Johnson and Schultz and Macron and the whole lot of them to get off their duffs and get the weapons in there, serious weaponry. It's gone on way, way too long.
Maria Zolkina, you said earlier there is a dynamic nonetheless. What's your feeling now?
First of all, my feeling is that Western countries, including Western Europe, became much more ready to support Ukraine from military point of view. I mean, by weapons and by some other supplies from a military branch, military industry branch, since last week of March. Before that, it was pretty difficult to speak about weapons supplies with Western Europe. As of now, those countries which have started to support Ukraine with concrete weapons previously, just after large-scale invasion, they are doing that in a much more intensive way, and they are sending to Ukraine much more lethal weapons than they sent before, which is positive dynamics in supporting Ukrainian army. But at the same time, there is positive dynamics, slow but still, when it comes to other Western countries which didn't want to send any weapons to Ukraine at all. But we have to understand that we cannot stop Putin in Ukraine just by using one type of methods. So this is the basket where should be weapons supply to Ukraine, serious weapons supply to Ukraine, especially now, economic pressure on Russia, and diplomatic pressure, which not necessarily means the talk about negotiations, how the political agreement should look like in the coming weeks as soon as possible, regardless what will be what will be after that, what will be consequences. Negotiations means also humanitarian component. For instance, I think that in order to save civilians from Mariupol, Western leaders could do much more personally than they have already done in terms of just declarations or appealing to Putin. We need to save people which are now bombarded, which are starving, which are without any kind of medical treatment. And this is a humanitarian issue which should be negotiated in a much stronger way than it was before. Altogether, it will stop Russian aggression.
One final question, Marian. We're almost out of time. So just in 30 seconds, what's your family and loved ones in Ukraine telling you the last 24 to 36 hours about this?
They told me like half of my family is defending Ukraine. And they told me that everything is on the right space, on the right track. We need weapons and we will be okay. We are fully capable of throwing Russian troops from our territory.
Maria Zolkina, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Warsaw. I want to thank Andrei Ilyanov in Washington, Fabrice Potier in Santander, Craig Kapitas. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.